Victoria, you do realize this restaurant costs more than you probably make in a month, right? My sister Grace's voice cut through the elegant ambiance of the Sterling room, and I felt my hand tighten around my water glass as I forced myself to smile, knowing that in less than an hour, everything would change forever. I'm Victoria, 29 years old, and I haven't seen my family in 5 years. Not since I made the unforgivable choice to become a chef instead of following the predetermined path they'd laid out for me, because in the prestigious family, cooking was something you hired people to do, not something you dedicated your life to mastering. The Sterling room hummed with the kind of understated luxury that my family had always valued. Crystal chandeliers casting soft light over tables dressed in crisp white linen, servers moving with practiced precision between the well-heeled diners. And I sat there in my simple black dress, watching my family critique every detail of the restaurant they didn't know belonged to me. "The portions here are ridiculously small," my mother Margaret complained, examining her amuse-bouche with obvious disdain, while my father Richard nodded in agreement, adding that in his day, restaurants actually fed you properly instead of charging $300 for artistic arrangements of microscopic food. My brother Daniel, now a senior partner at a prestigious law firm, checked his Rolex for the third time since we'd sat down, clearly calculating how much billable time this family obligation was costing him, while his wife Jennifer photographed every dish for her Instagram, captioning each with vapid observations about treating ourselves to the finer things. Grace's fiancé, Preston, had chosen this venue to impress my parents with his connections, boasting about how he'd pulled strings to get a reservation at the city's most exclusive restaurant, never knowing that I'd been turning away reservation requests for months, that celebrities begged for tables I could give away with a single phone call. "So, Victoria," Preston leaned forward with that condescending smile I'd already learned to despise. "Grace tells me you're still playing around in kitchens. Any plans to pursue something more substantial?" I took a slow sip of water, tasting the subtle hint of cucumber and mint I'd insisted we add to our filtered water, and smiled back at him, thinking about the empire I'd built while they'd written me off as a failure, and how in just a few more courses, their whole world would tilt on its axis. The pattern of my family's dismissal had started long before that night 5 years ago, when I announced I was leaving my MBA program. It began the moment I showed more interest in our housekeeper Carmen's Puerto Rican recipes than in my mother's charity galas, when I spent summers working in restaurant kitchens instead of interning at law firms like my siblings. "Remember when Victoria wanted to go to that cooking camp instead of debate camp?" Grace laughed, twirling her engagement ring so it caught the light. Mom had to literally bribe her with a trip to Paris to get her to choose properly, and everyone joined in the laughter while I remembered crying myself to sleep that summer, surrounded by trophies for arguments I never wanted to win. Every family gathering followed the same script. Daniel would discuss his latest legal victories while our parents beamed with pride. Grace would detail her rise through the ranks at Goldman Sachs to appreciative nods, and when they finally turned to me, their expressions would shift to barely concealed disappointment, as if my very presence reminded them of their one failure as parents. "At least she's working," my Aunt Patricia had said at one Thanksgiving, patting my hand with nauseating condescension. "Not everyone can handle the pressure of real careers," while my cousins smirked behind their wine glasses, secure in their positions at hedge funds and consulting firms, never knowing I'd already been promoted twice at the restaurant where I'd started as a prep cook. The financial manipulation had been particularly cruel. When I'd asked for help during culinary school, my father had offered to pay my tuition in full, but only if I switched to law school, and when I refused, he'd made sure I knew exactly how much money I was walking away from, $87,000 per year for 3 years. Numbers he repeated whenever my student loan payments left me choosing between rent and groceries. My mother's approach was more subtle but equally devastating, sending me job listings for executive assistant positions at Fortune 500 companies with notes like, "Just until you come to your senses," or forwarding articles about former chefs who'd grown up and pursued MBAs, each message a tiny dagger designed to make me doubt my choices. Even my accomplishments were twisted into failures. When I won a young chef competition, they told people I'd won a cooking contest, like a county fair. And when a food critic praised my innovative technique in a review, my father asked if I'd considered using my creativity for something that actually mattered, like corporate strategy or market analysis, because in their world, feeding people's souls meant nothing compared to feeding their portfolios. The event that finally shattered my last hope of family acceptance happened 2 months ago, when my father called me at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, his voice carrying that particular tone of crisis that had always made my stomach drop. "Victoria, we need you at the house immediately. It's about your grandmother's estate." And I'd driven through the rain thinking someone had died, only to discover they'd gathered the entire family for an ambush. They sat arranged in the living room like a tribunal, my parents on the antique sofa, Daniel and Grace in the wingback chairs, even my aunts and uncles positioned strategically around the room, and in the center of the coffee table lay a stack of papers that I recognized as Grandma's will, the one that had named me as partial beneficiary of her $2.3 million estate, because I was the only grandchild who'd spent weekends learning her traditional recipes. "We've been discussing the situation," my father began, using his courtroom voice that had won him countless cases, "and we all agree that it would be best if you signed your portion over to be managed by the family trust, since you clearly lack the financial acumen to handle such a sum responsibly." And I watched as every head in the room nodded in agreement, as if my inability to manage money was an established fact. Grace leaned forward with false concern. "We're trying to protect you, Victoria, because what happens when your little restaurant job doesn't work out? When you're 40 and still renting a studio apartment, wishing you had this money that you frittered away on some foolish dream of opening your own place? Never knowing I'd already signed the lease on a prime location, that I'd been meeting with investors for months. "The decision has already been made," my mother added, sliding the papers toward me with a pen. "Daniel has graciously agreed to manage your portion alongside his own, ensuring it grows properly instead of being wasted on some food truck or whatever unrealistic scheme you're probably planning." And I saw Daniel nod magnanimously, as if he was doing me an enormous favor by stealing my inheritance. I looked around that room at the faces of people who shared my blood, but had never shared my dreams, who saw my passion as a character flaw to be corrected rather than a gift to be nurtured, and felt something inside me break and crystallize simultaneously. Because this wasn't about protecting me from financial ruin. This was about control, about punishing me for daring to choose differently. "If you don't sign," my father continued, his voice hardening, "we'll have no choice but to contest the will on grounds of undue influence, since you clearly manipulated your grandmother during her final years with your cooking and visits." And that's when I understood that they would rather drag our grandmother's memory through court than allow me to have what she'd freely given. I stood up without signing, without speaking, and walked out of that house knowing I would never return as the same person, that Victoria the disappointment was dead, and something harder, more determined, had taken her place, someone who would prove them wrong in ways they couldn't imagine. The morning after that family ambush, I sat in my studio apartment staring at Grandma's inheritance statement on my laptop, $2.3 million that they wanted to control, and I made the decision that would change everything. I would use every cent to build something they could never take away, never dismiss, never diminish with their condescending smiles. My days became a carefully orchestrated performance where I maintained my role as the struggling line cook at Chez Laurent, arriving at 5 a.m. for prep work, sweating through double shifts, while my evenings transformed into intensive business planning sessions with lawyers who specialized in restaurant acquisitions, contractors who understood my vision, and suppliers who could provide the quality I demanded. The hardest part was maintaining the facade during unavoidable family interactions, like when Grace called to check if I'd reconsidered signing over my inheritance, and I had to bite my tongue while she lectured me about financial responsibility, all while I was negotiating a $1.8 million purchase agreement for a prime restaurant space in the city's most coveted culinary district. I found allies in unexpected places. Martin, a commercial real estate attorney who'd been blacklisted by traditional firms for refusing to play politics, understood what it meant to build outside the system, and Sarah, a former Wall Street analyst turned restaurant consultant, taught me to read P&L statements with the same intensity I read recipes. Every rejection from banks who wouldn't take me seriously, every supplier who quoted me tourist prices, every contractor who tried to oversell unnecessary renovations, they all became fuel for my determination, documented in notebooks where I tracked every slight that would make my eventual revelation even sweeter. My secret weapon was the network I'd built during years in professional kitchens, because while my family networked at country clubs, I'd earned the loyalty of sous chefs who now ran their own kitchens, line cooks who'd become food critics, dishwashers who'd worked up to become suppliers, all bound by understanding that respect was earned with burnt fingers and 16-hour days. The moment I knew my plan would work came during a tasting with my assembled team, When Marcus, who'd been maitre d' at 3 Michelin-starred restaurants, tasted my signature dish and said, "This is it, Chef Victoria. This is the food that changes everything." And I realized I wasn't just building a restaurant, I was building a fortress. Late at night, when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me, I'd reread Grandma's handwritten recipes, her notes about how food was love made tangible, how a perfectly balanced dish could say what words couldn't, and I promised her memory that I would use her gift to prove that choosing passion over convention wasn't just valid, it was victorious. Through it all, I kept my family completely in the dark, accepting their pity at holiday gatherings, nodding when they offered to help me find real work, knowing that soon, very soon, the Sterling Room would open its doors, and everything they believed about success, about me, would shatter like champagne flutes at midnight. 6 weeks before the Sterling Room's soft opening, I orchestrated every detail with the precision of a surgeon, knowing that timing would be everything, that the revelation needed to happen naturally, organically, devastatingly. And when Grace called to invite me to her engagement dinner, suggesting we meet at this impossibly exclusive new restaurant Preston managed to book, I knew the universe was aligning in my favor. "You probably can't afford it," she'd added with that casual cruelty she'd perfected over years. "But don't worry, Preston insists on paying for everyone. He wants to impress Mom and Dad." And I'd accepted graciously, even offering to contribute what I could, playing the part of the grateful poor relation while mentally reviewing the evening's menu I'd personally crafted for maximum impact. The soft opening weeks were strategically designed to build buzz among the city's most influential food critics and socialites, people whose opinions my family actually valued, and I made sure to stay completely behind the scenes, letting Marcus and my management team be the public face, while I remained the mysterious chef owner that everyone speculated about, but no one could identify. My masterstroke was hiring Jessica, Daniel's former paralegal who'd been unfairly dismissed from his firm, as senior server, knowing she understood exactly why this revelation mattered, and training her to deliver the final blow with perfect timing, because sometimes the best revenge comes from unexpected allies who share your appetite for justice. I planted seeds throughout the city's culinary scene, giving exclusive tastings to food bloggers who ran in my family's peripheral social circles, ensuring that by the time the Sterling Room officially opened, it would be the only restaurant anyone in their world was talking about. The reservation impossible to get unless you knew someone. And of course, they thought Preston knew someone. The financial press started picking up the story of the mysterious young chef who'd turned a failed nightclub into the city's hottest dining destination in record time, speculating about backing from tech billionaires or foreign investors, never guessing that the funding came from an inheritance that was supposed to be managed by responsible hands, not wasted on a working-class fantasy. 3 days before the dinner, I did a final walkthrough with my team, ensuring every detail would be perfect, from the specific table they'd be seated at, center stage, where everyone could see them, to the timing of each course, to the moment when the bill would arrive showing only the wine charges, setting up the confusion that would lead to my grand revelation. "Remember," I told Marcus during our final briefing, "they'll be critical of everything because that's who they are, but maintain absolute professionalism until the moment of truth, and then deliver the line exactly as we practiced." And he smiled with the confidence of someone who understood that great service sometimes means serving justice. The night before the dinner, I stood in my empty restaurant after hours, looking at what I'd built with Grandma's gift and my own determination, thinking about how she'd always said the secret ingredient in any dish was intention, and tomorrow, my intention would finally be clear, to show them that the family disappointment had become everything they said I could never be, and I'd done it without their approval, without their connections, without their permission, only with the inheritance they'd tried to steal and the passion they'd tried to kill. The moment arrived with the precision of a perfectly timed souffle when Preston, his face flushed from the $800 bottle of Chateau Margaux he'd insisted on ordering to impress my father, opened the leather check folder and his expression shifted from smug satisfaction to complete confusion. "There's been a mistake," he announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "They've only charged us for the wine, not the 7-course tasting menu." My mother, who'd spent the entire evening making subtle digs about my appearance, suddenly looked concerned about the potential embarrassment of a billing error at such an exclusive establishment, while my father straightened his tie nervously, and Grace's perfectly composed facade cracked as she hissed at Preston to handle it quietly, but he was already signaling for the server with the kind of aggressive entitlement that made restaurant workers everywhere dream of revenge. Marcus approached our table with the measured steps of someone who'd been waiting for this moment as long as I had, his expression professionally neutral as Preston thrust the bill at him. "This is wrong. You've made an error. We had 7 people dining on the chef's tasting menu plus wine pairings." And I watched my family's faces, memorizing every micro-expression for the satisfaction I'd replay forever. "There's no error, sir," Marcus replied smoothly, his voice carrying just enough volume for the adjacent tables to hear. "The dinner portion has been taken care of." And when my father demanded to know by whom, Marcus turned to me with a smile that broke through his professional mask. "Welcome back, Ms. Victoria. Your meeting with the investors from Shanghai is ready in the private dining room whenever you're prepared." The silence that followed was more delicious than any dish I'd ever created. 6 faces frozen in variations of shock, confusion, and dawning comprehension. While I sat perfectly still, letting the moment marinate like a fine wine, savoring the way Grace's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, how Daniel's lawyer brain was visibly trying to process this impossible information. "I don't understand," my mother finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper, and I took a slow sip of water before responding. "Welcome to the Sterling Room, Mother, my restaurant." Letting those 2 words land with the weight of everything they'd tried to deny me, every dream they'd called foolish, every choice they'd deemed worthless. Preston was the first to attempt recovery, his business instincts kicking in as he tried to reframe the narrative. "You work here? As what? The manager?" And I almost felt sorry for him as I shook my head. "I own it, Preston. Every table, every chair, every perfectly portioned dish you complained about tonight. I built this from the ground up with the inheritance you all tried to steal from me." "That's impossible," Grace sputtered, her face cycling through emotions I'd never seen her display so transparently. "This place has been booked solid for months. Food critics are calling it revolutionary. There was a 3-page spread in Architectural Digest." And I nodded. "Yes, that was a particularly nice article. They loved what I did with the original Art Deco fixtures." My father, who'd spent the evening lecturing the sommelier about wine despite knowing nothing beyond price points, cleared his throat and attempted to take control. "Victoria, why didn't you tell us about this development?" As if my success was just another business acquisition to be evaluated and managed. But I was done being managed, done being handled, done pretending their opinion of my life mattered. "The same reason you're all sitting here tonight," I said, standing slowly, smoothing my simple black dress that probably cost more than Grace's entire outfit, despite its understated elegance. "Because I wanted you to see who I really am when you thought I was nobody. And now you know exactly what you've spent 5 years dismissing, criticizing, and trying to control." And with that, I turned toward my investors, leaving my family to digest a truth more complex than any meal I could create. 3 months after that dinner, I stood in the Sterling Room's kitchen during the afternoon lull, teaching a group of culinary students from the community college how to properly balance flavors in our signature sauce, watching their faces light up with understanding the same way mine had in Grandma's kitchen all those years ago, and I realized this was what success actually looked like. My family had tried, in their way, to reconnect after that night, sending carefully worded emails about how proud they were of my achievements, how they'd always known I had potential, but I'd learned to recognize the difference between respect and opportunism, between love and the desire to be associated with success they hadn't nurtured. So I kept my responses polite but distant, professional boundaries firmly in place. Grace's wedding invitation arrived on expensive cardstock with a handwritten note asking if the Sterling Room could cater the reception, a request so transparently transactional that I almost admired its boldness, and I declined with the same grace she'd shown me over the years, suggesting several excellent catering companies that would be more suitable for her special day, because forgiveness didn't require me to provide services for people who only valued me as a vendor. The Shanghai investors had funded my second location, and food critics were calling the Sterling Room the restaurant that defines modern American dining. But those accolades mattered less than the message I received from a young line cook who'd been rejected by her family for choosing culinary school over medical school, thanking me for proving that our dreams weren't foolish, that choosing passion over parental approval could lead to extraordinary things. Every morning, I walk into my restaurant before dawn, breathing in the scent of fresh herbs and possibilities, and I think about Grandma's words, how she'd told me that the best dishes come from understanding that cooking isn't about following someone else's recipe, it's about creating your own, and I'd finally learned that the same was true for life. the most satisfying success comes not from meeting others' expectations, but from exceeding your own.